funding for Europeans' unemployed youth would doubtlessly cost a pile of money, but just a fraction of the zeros of the many zeros which have been and are probably going to be swallowed by the rescue of the banks and the states. We should have no fear of direct democracy. Without transnational opportunities for interventions from below, without European referenda on European themes, which send a shudder through the ocean liner of Europe, the whole enterprise will fail. Why not directly elect the President of the European Commission in an election campaign involving all European citizens on the same day, which would just for the first time be a European in the strict sense? You have to remember when we had a decision process on the Constitution of Europe, it was called the Constitution of Europe at this time, it was just a national matter. One nation after the other was giving its vote to Europe. There was not a European event, there was not a European public. And of course, this kind of voting would need a different procedure. You couldn't say that all countries and all people have to agree with this constitution. You maybe need, I don't know, we have to talk about, maybe you need 2/3 of the countries, or I don't know what amount of ever, we have to talk about it. And at the same time, a quorum of the population. There have to be procedural norms, so people can say no, and it doesn't have the implication that the whole issue breaks down. But it would be an issue at the same day, and we would have a campaign and a conflict about Europe in all countries. This could fail, but at least then we find out that something fails and has been done. Maybe it starts again in a new way, and the European citizens have to learn what Europe actually means for them and what kind of implications it has for themselves. It might also make sense to appoint a new constitutional convention, which this time would confer democratic legitimation to another Europe. I would suggest to rename, not only reframe, but rename Europe. My suggestion would to say European Communities of Democracy, which is not the European Union, but the new, we have different names at different phases of development of the European Union, started with the market community and so on and so on. And I thought now we need a new frame and a new name in order to show that we are really heading for a new way of democratization of Europe from below. Europe has to be a matter of the citizen, or it will not have a future. Only if the citizens take part in Europe, there will be a Europe in the future. And you only have a solution to the euro crisis if there is, at least in the long-term perspective, a perspective for the European citizen to take part in this issue. If it's just, again, an elite issue like it has been before, there will be no actually acceptance of those constructions, whatever they are in economic terms. And therefore, it's so important to not only see that the economic crisis, that the euro crisis needs political answers, like economic political answers, but it needs a cultural answer as well. It needs, as I say, a new idea of democracy from below, and it needs even a new idea of democracy beyond the nation state. It's not only a national democracy, but it's a democracy beyond the nation state. And there are quite a few theories and ideas in the social scientists who go with this direction. The cosmopolitan European democracy, which binds the national democracy, cannot be a national democracy. I think this is one of the issues in the background. When we talk about a European democracy, it cannot be it cannot be the same as a national democracy. Otherwise, we always have this either or. Then there's only a European and not a national democracy. It has to be something specific. It has to have maybe a European Parliament, but has to have more than that, different elements, because this is a specific identity of Europe, combining democracies. So actually, those democracies have to be contained and have to be acknowledged, and at the same time there have to be new kinds of interventions and elements of democracy on the transnational level. So the answer to the question I have raised in this lecture has to be: the new Europe should not follow the model of the German Euro nationalism, but should be an emerging European community of democracies. And the pooling of sovereignty and the pooling of democracies could be an increase or a multiplier of the power of Europe and the power of democracy in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Bueno, tenemos un rato para hacer preguntas a Ulrich Beck, por el profesor Íñigo Bullain. Bullain, sí. Profesor,
Ja.
Willkommen in Baskenland, Herr Professor Beck. Vielen Dank für Ihr Gespräch und also für Ihren Denken und Texte. Ich habe nur eine kleine Frage für Ihnen. Was wartete Sie für nächste Woche europäische Gipfel?
Ja, danke.
Yeah, I asked Professor Beck about what does he expect from next European summit in next week. I also have a small gift, a small present for Professor Beck. He asks before about his new title, Welt Innenpolitik, and he asked about translation in Basque.
Yeah.
As you know, Basque is a European treasure.
Yeah.
And my suggestion is Mundu Barneko Politika. So that's my kleines Wort für Ihnen. And I also have a suggestion or maybe a comment. When you say that you expect more Europe and a more democratized Europe, and you want a Europe of citizens, my comment is, Professor Beck, the problem we have here in Europe is that we don't have a communicative communicative
Space. Network.
We have a communicative
Public.
network. Yeah. We don't have a European television, radios. Yes. We don't have a monthly or a weekly magazine. Yeah. Democracy is more just than giving a vote or electing a president, although I think those are good ideas. We need also a European public opinion, and therefore we need this kind of network.
Yeah.
So, vielen Dank.
Yeah, maybe I start by answering your last question, or try to answer it. That's correct. We don't have European newspapers. We don't have a public discussion. It's even, to me, it's even a bigger concern that the social movements are mostly not addressing European institutions, but national institutions. Or the uprise of the youth, which we experience in different countries of Europe, are addressing the national government and not the European, even if it is a European issue. And maybe even if they are experiencing a European fate, they are not addressing it on on a transnational level. But in relation to the public, I think we have to realize again, I would say for the first time actually, at least as far as I can remember, Europe is the topic of all national papers. It's, you know, if you look at the European at the national news conference, all are talking about Europe. So my first answer is we don't, maybe even should not, only look for a specialized, Europeanized public. But the European public could happen and should happen in the national context as well. You know, this is actually a cosmopolitan vision. Otherwise, we would compare the national, does it still work? Maybe I use this one. We would compare or misunderstand the European level with the national level again. So if I look how much, if I would, as a social scientist, ask how much there is a European public in Europe, then I would, at least as one dimension, look at the national papers, how much they are discussing European issues, and how strong this discussion is in the national context, not specialized to only a European issue. Again, you know, we are scrambled eggs, and it could happen that the yellow problem could be discussed in the white context as well. What are my expectations for the next conference of the finance ministers? Well, it is difficult to look in the future, especially if you are a sociologist, you're always trying to look at the facts. But to me, it's interesting that in relation to the Euro crisis, we are experiencing what I call a cosmopolitan imperative. And this cosmopolitan imperative means cooperate or fail. Or to say it in German categories, I'm sorry to say it in German categories, catastrophe or Kant. Catastrophe or Kant. You know, catastrophe, like many people are expecting it, or more cooperation to create a new Europe. And so far, this mechanism worked to some extent. At least you can, if you look at the German chancellor, you know, she didn't want to act. She wanted to wait. She didn't do anything for a whole year. And suddenly she realized there could be a catastrophe. And the more the catastrophe was anticipated, like I said, its risk is the anticipation of risk of catastrophe, the more suddenly she became active. Only in her way of acting, but at least something happened. And now she seems to be at least a mixture of a German politics and a European vision. And therefore, to give a short answer, I would say the catastrophe will not happen. They will still find small steps for cooperation, which means there's going to be the money for Greece is going to there's going to be decision to give the money to Greece, and of course there's going to be an enlargement of the possible money for different other European countries.
Yes, my question is directly related to the future of Europe and which Europe we want. You commented already on the risk of, or the danger of Euro-nationalism as opposed to a cosmopolitan vision of Europe. I see that in this moment we are actually running a risk of repeating some historical errors by strengthening the European we and strengthening Europe. We want more Europe. Aren't we really risking to recreate some of the problems that European integration actually solved in the 20th century? I mean, there seemed to be a consensus that the main achievements of European integrations were basically that as Europeans we managed to overcome the thinking in terms of us and them towards the other European peoples. We overcame these political dynamics of alienation among peoples. Yeah. Aren't we really just lifting up the problem to a European level, which is kind of paradoxical in a globalized world? Is it possible to strengthen Europe without this Euro-nationalism and without recreating the very same problematic dynamics at a global level? Thank you.
Well, it's a very important question, actually. It really puts the point on one of those wounds. Everybody is talking about, or many people are talking about more Europe, but what does more Europe mean? And I try to say that there are different interpretations, different models for more Europe. Many think of a strengthening of the European institutions, maybe even beyond the parliament, giving more authority to a new economic government, more authority to, as is being called, commissioners who try to look at the countries who don't follow the lines of the European Unions. And I think this term of a commissioner made me think about, I'm sorry, this is just an association of words I had, about the Soviet bloc. They had commissioners like this as well. And the difference is that, well, there are many differences, but one of the differences, to put it in ironical terms, that the countries of the Soviet bloc did have to plan their economy on terms of production and wealth production, and the countries of the European Union in future have to create plans how to diminish their debts. And those are 5-year plans as well, and they're controlled by the Commission. And this brings up a dynamic of as you say, of nationalities. And it's actually creating by itself this dynamic. So actually, if I have the same concern, even if we are successful to some extent in solving the euro crisis, the effect or the reality which comes out of this process could be quite threatening, could be quite a different power structure. This is what actually was one of my main concerns I wanted to express in this lecture. But I think more Europe doesn't have to mean this kind of more Europe in a national centralized sense of the meaning, like many people do think it has to be. I think there are only very few who are opening up to a different perspective now. This is why I'm addressing the issue of the citizens of Europe. And I think actually it wouldn't be if we here today, or maybe some people else start from below an initiative that there should be like the saving of the Europe, there should be a new beginning of the Europe of citizens. This could really spread as something which makes sense to many people and could be even financed. It doesn't cost so much. So there would be a new drive to democracy. I'm not sure if this really happens. And then, of course, more Europe would have become a completely different meaning. It means the strengthening of local, national, regional actors. It is more a vision of not only creating central institutions in Europe, but connecting and cooperating on the level of regions and cities and communities between different nations and cultures, trying to show what Europe means for people in this dimension. And well, if you would ask me why I still do have this optimistic view, which is a view, I would have two answers. First of all, not being optimistic is very easy. It's much more difficult to have it's very easy, especially in Europe. There's only mostly a pessimistic tradition, so it's not very hard work to be this. And the second one is, I still believe in modernity as creative, as something as a creative a resource for creativity, political creativity, freedom. This opens up spaces, gives new creativity. Actually, this museum we are talking about is maybe one of the best examples of this kind of modernity I have in mind. And this is a situation where Europe really has to make a decision, going this way or that way. So I basically agree with you, but there could be the meaning of a more Europe in a more democratic sense.
Oh, first of all, thank you for coming. Second of all, I had a question. Do you think that while Europe is engaging in developing this grassroots democracy, do you think it should continue expanding, or if it should stop expanding and work to better itself from within before trying to attract new members?
Yeah. Shall I answer? Yeah. Well, I still believe in extension. I know this is sometimes it's hard to defend, but for example, if you ask what is actually the power of Europe, what is the specific power of Europe? It's not the it's not the military power. It's not something which we normally relate to the concept of power. It is you can watch a power of Europe by those countries who want to become part of Europe, because the power of Europe is the attractiveness of Europe. Many people, many countries want to become part of the European Union, and they even organize a process of self-Europeanization. They organize a process of law and so on and so on. Many criteria which are quite tough criteria which they have to fit in order to become European Union. So to some extent, the non-members of the European Union who have a perspective to become members are already changing basically. And if we disappoint them, this is going to be quite a problem for Europe, because then we really build again national borders of exclusion. I think this is true in relation to Turkey. Turkey and all its cultural background it stands for would be an important contribution to Europe, would open it up to the new cultures and new religions, and would make the idea of plurality in Europe more real. So I think it is we would lose a lot of the European identity if we not at least give different countries who really want to become part of Europe a perspective. So it is a realistic perspective, so they are going to change themselves in order to become a member.
On these days, we are witnessing once again the mobilizations in Germany against the transport of nuclear garbage, as that have many links with some other mobilizations of grassroots movements that are manifesting themselves whenever a new summit of governments are trying to build this European identity from the top, from the summit. So I wanted to ask you, how do you contemplate all these movements, whether it might be these anti-nuclear movements or the movements against the most harsh consequences of globalization, the lack and the loss of rights all around Europe, social rights and welfare rights. How do you contemplate these grassroots movements, sometimes based in civil disobedience, but in a broad democratic way, in the frame of this cosmopolitan approach of the construction of a European identity based in a basic sense of democracy?
Yes, I do see the central role of those movements. I think they are very important, and as I mentioned the tax on financial transformations as an example that politicians learn from those movements, even if it takes quite some time. Suddenly they are becoming part of normal politics, or at least reform politics. And here again, I think those movements, what we actually need is a discussion, a public discussion, maybe a conflict even, not only a discussion, a conflict about different models of Europe in the present and the future. And we even would have to go, I think, a step farther and have to talk about different models maybe of capitalism in relation to nation states and to ecological issues and all those issues which have been raised by the social movement. On the other hand, we have to realize, at least I think, that social movements by itself cannot enforce law. Don't have the authority to enforce law, so they cannot make their politics real. They have to cooperate with states, maybe with business as well. They know this and they do this and they're quite effective in doing this. But there has to be, again, a cooperation beyond borders, and not only as it has been so far between the state and the capital, the actor of state and capital, and workers maybe, but also a new kind of involvement and cooperation between states and social movements. And states could, and social movements could even address those issues of cooperation between different countries. This cosmopolitan issue could be part of their agenda. And actually, they could enforce these issues, and they do it to some extent. I think the movement Occupy Wall Street is an interesting example. Who would have believed 2 months ago that in the center of capitalism, a 99 movement came up enforced by the middle classes, not by the lower classes, enforced by the middle classes and criticizing a basic issue of capitalism. Well, in a very plural sense, there are all kind of mixtures, but at least they're addressing those issues. It's opening up the space, and maybe this is even more important than picking up very specific issues right now. Of course, those movements are always in danger to break down, as we know. They are not sustainable in the same way as parties are, so there has to be some kind of transformation between those. This is all known and quite complicated, but I think since the 1970s, you have a continued experience about the importance of social movement for national politics in relation to the environmental issue, in relation to climate issues, in relation to the financial crisis now, and many other issues which have ignored by scientists, have ignored by state politics, and have been addressed through hard conflicts by social movements, and this is what we depend on. Yeah.
Si no hago yo una, puedo hacer. Aquí hay una, sí.
But sorry, isn't it? You said that you expect that it would be better to create a Europe from below, but isn't it like in the state of crisis that we observe exactly the opposite, because like the financial markets react so quickly, so only the leaders govern. meet in union to decide things very quickly. They don't even consult with the local parliaments in some stages, I guess. Isn't it exactly the opposite? Or does it, what is actually happening right now due to this, simply the fast reaction of the financial system?
Well, to some extent, of course, you're right. It's happening the opposite. But, well, it's not only in relation to the financial crisis, in relation to many other issues. Because of globalization, because of this crisis and risk, many issues are being redefined as informal issues. They are not part of the parliamentary formal discussions or the public discussions. They're getting into informal circles who decide about those issues. So we have, even inside of the national democracy, we are losing democracy because this informalization of power in all kind of issues. Well, I would say this is not sustainable. This is a process which is not sustainable. If you think about this not in idealistic terms, but in realistic terms, as I would put it, you have to conceptualize some kind of democratization of those processes. If you don't do it, this is going to change into a power structure which is beyond our reach and beyond a democratic imperative. And I still believe that people realize this and that the movements are a reaction to this situation. If it becomes real politics is an open question, which depends on ourselves as well, yes.
Yes, I mean, if you take a look at the walls, you know, there are Basque words there. You mean we're in the Basque country right now, okay? So here we always think we're Basque.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there is people that, you know, before thinking about Spain, we think about the Basque country. So how can we start to build Europe without thinking about Spain, thinking about Germany? When you talk about democratic, I mean, you can always think that if there is a real democratic in Europe and you are going to vote for some institution in Europe, Germany is always, I mean, the Germans are always going to vote for 80 million people, you know, 80 million votes. So I think right now it's quite difficult because, you know, every time you see a politician in the TV, you are always thinking that he's German, he's French. Even with Durão Barroso, you always say he's Portuguese. So it's, how do we start to construct Europe from below? I mean, I think maybe we need a generation, or maybe I don't know. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Yes, I do understand your question. It's very difficult, as you say. But even, you know, I'm a sociologist. I'm not so much interested in utopia, I'm interested in reality. And one of the basic realities is that if you think you are a homogeneous region or homogeneous culture, this is the wrong picture you have. Let me give you the example of Germany. Every third children under 5 years has a migration background in Germany. Every third child under 5 years has a migration background in Germany. So actually there's some kind of cosmopolitization going on right in the center of our lives. And I would say maybe, I don't know what is happening in your region. I would say it's the same happening over here. And the same kind of business structures which are interconnected at the same time. So the reality is different than we imagine it, and than we think it is. And the reality is this kind of mixture. As I said, we are scrambled eggs. And this scrambled eggs cannot be separated. And if we realize that this is the case. And if we build on this situation, I think we have quite good basis, quite good ground for constructing Europe from below, because we actually have to look at our own identities and find out that we are not only one basic and main identity, there's a mixture of all kinds of identities in which we are living, and this is actually Europe. If you look at Europe, if you ask what Europe is, it's not something out there. It's not something which makes you different in a specific way. It's part of your, if it is real, it's part of your local, national, personal, family, love identity or whatsoever. And I think this is quite a good starting point for a Europeanization from below.
Bueno, entonces me dejáis hacer una pregunta, ¿no? Por lo que veo. Hace unos días escribía un artículo Jürgen Habermas en varios periódicos europeos denunciando la Europa postdemocrática y haciendo un antagonismo entre las élites y las poblaciones y criticando a los gobiernos técnicos, especialmente en Italia y en Grecia, ¿no? A mí personalmente esa contraposición no me ha resultado convincente porque creo... no.
Just go ahead, I get the idea. Yeah, good.
No me resultaba convincente porque me parece que en estos momentos los pueblos son parte del problema y no tanto de la solución. No siempre hacer un referéndum es la mejor democratización de un problema. Muchas veces es la manera de estropearlo definitivamente. El ejemplo del referéndum propuesto por Papandreou me parece muy significativo de esa irresponsabilidad. Cuando las sociedades europeas hemos sido bombardeadas por el antieuropeísmo, por los instintos proteccionistas más elementales, un referéndum, una apelación al pueblo, me parece que no resuelve el problema. Entonces, yo creo que estamos en un momento en el cual la legitimidad en Europa ha girado un poco hacia lo que podemos llamar una legitimidad funcional y no tanto una legitimidad democrática desde abajo arriba, en el sentido clásico, ¿no? Bueno, me gustaría saber cuál era su opinión sobre esto, ¿no? In Grunde genommen, was meinst du über den Vorschlag von Habermas, diese Kritik an den postdemokratischen Union?
Well, yes, Jürgen Habermas is the most important European voice right now. I think not only in Germany, but in Europe. It's quite interesting to ask where are the European intellectuals in the situations, and it is sad to find out that there are not very many voices. So I think he is a very important. We are good friends, by the way, and I think he has a very important point, saying that Europe is getting. There's a danger of Europe getting a post-democratic issue. The concept of post-democracy has been made by a British political science, I lost his name now, but it was very much related to the nation state already. Even the nation states, not only Europe, are getting post-national, post-democratic, because as I said before, all the decisions are being transformed, or many decisions, many power structures are getting informal. They are not being decided on the formal way of democracy. So the concept of post-democracy in relating to Europe must have a different meaning. You have to explain what it means in relation to Europe. I think in Europe we need a democracy, or ideas of democracy which are to some extent which are to some extent in the national sense post-democratic, in the national sense. We need, for example, as I said in my lecture, referenda as a way of intervention, direct intervention of people from below using European issues and putting those issues on the agenda of European politics. I think this is a new way of let's say, to some extent, a post democratic element for the European issue, and others as well. So I think we have to me, I have to confess, the term post is not very efficient, because it only says what we not have and it doesn't say what we have. Since I'm thinking about risk society, I'm always trying to get beyond post. Everything is beyond, everything is post, everything is trans. So we don't say actually what it is. And I think in relation to the European democracy, we have to become specific. What kind of new democratic elements do we want? And how can this self-enforcement of the citizens of Europe, I think where Jürgen Habermas and myself totally agree, can be implemented. And this actually is a paradox. You have to realize, we are talking as social scientists and maybe as politicians, how do we implant Europeanization from below? How can we make the activity happening from below? This is a paradox, and it's one of those paradoxes which has to be solved somehow. Thank you.
Si es breve la pregunta, breve la formulación y breve la contestación, podría ser la última, ¿no?
No, I just wanted to challenge a little bit more your optimism about the citizens' Europe. For me, what I see of somewhat of a citizens' Europe is precisely these social movements trying to struggle together against this more top-down vision of Europe, which we commented up before. And for me, there is a risk of saying we want more citizens into Europe. There is a risk of what might happen if it's as if we say, no, we want more women in the military. I mean, the military, if there are more women, won't be less sexist, less hierarchical. Less. So for me, the challenge would be, do you feel that optimistic that really enough citizens from below could be interested in really changing the model of today's Europe, and would the Europeans, the power structure, be willing to give away some of their power? I mean, that's a power problem, basically. And then the second doubt I have about what I see now in this top-down Europe is that, especially with the economic crisis on us, it is really also a two-speed Europe, in the sense that all these economic structures are still very, very much dominated by men. And I also feel that in that way, this citizens' Europe also has to take into account this basic inequality, which at the political level is a bit better now, but on the economic level is still very, very much a problem. So,
well, I actually do see your point. It's quite important. First of all, it's not easy to empower the citizens in Europe. When you empower the citizens in Europe, others lose power, as you say, and this is a conflict. And it has to be a conflict. And most people, workers, for example, don't see any reason to engage for Europe. The unions don't, to some extent, even if they should to some extent, because they lose on the national level, they lose their power in relation to transnational capital. They have to organize on the European level. I'm preaching this for years, but they don't pick it up because of many reasons. So there are lots of restructuring power means conflicts, means really basic conflicts. It's not an easy issue. And you are right, the role of women in this process is open. Maybe it's even not open. It's very much, to some extent, against women. But I think the implication is, first of all, like we experienced it in the environmental movements, there's a lot of opposition, and suddenly there's a conversion. Not suddenly, it's over years and years and years. It happened in relation to atomic energy in Germany. It was such a fight, and then suddenly Merkel got converted herself and made the change, because suddenly she is very good in power. She is very good in knowing what power means and how power has to be legitimated. And she realized that, at least in the German context, just going ahead in her old way and backing atomic energy would just mean that she loses power in Germany. And I think those are the situations. And then the second realistic aspect is that there always has to be, I don't know, a mixture between parties and social movements as well, which is complicated. And states and social movements, the women movement shows the importance of state, because it shows the importance of law as a guarantee for equality between gender, which is actually enforced by the state and not enforced on the level of movements. So I think in order to make this conflict between different agents of power realistic, movements have to become parties to some extent, or there has to be a cooperation between those two issues. Why don't people really care about Europe? Why don't they understand what Europe is actually about, what Europe means for themselves? If you take the example of workers, I think workers have a very specific experience in relation to globalization and Europe. It threatens their existence. It threatens their economic existence, because to some extent they become exchangeable to workers in different countries, which have a lower payment. And this is a threat, basic economic threat to their life, which has to be taken seriously. It's nothing we can ignore. So a Europe which would be a Europe of redefinition of social security, not only of the market, but of social security, of some elements of a welfare state in a European perspective, which tells the narrative to the workers, actually, you don't get security from the state anymore, at least not as much as you should, but Europe stands for your social security as well, would be a different model again of more Europe. And I think a very important one. So actually it's not about only being for Europe or against Europe, it's a question, again, what Europe do we want? And what kind of Europe, what model of Europe do we want? And I think the time of crisis is to open up our perspective and getting away only from the market Europe, including a social Europe, including more power to the citizens of Europe.
Bueno, seguro que estaríamos mucho tiempo más hablando de estas interesantes cuestiones con el profesor Ulrich Beck, pero entre otras cosas nos interesa no agotarle para que pueda volver a venir otras veces. Para aquellos a los que esto les haya sabido a poco y se puedan desplazar mañana a San Sebastián, hay un seminario a las 10:30 en la Biblioteca Carlos Santamaría de la UPV, en el que él y Elisabeth Beck-Gersheim presentarán su último libro, Fernliebe, Love at Distance, en castellano se publicará a comienzos del año que viene, Amor a Distancia, donde explican cómo la globalización no solamente afecta a los mercados financieros, a la comunicación, sino también a las relaciones afectivas, a la transformación de las familias, del amor, etc., ¿no? Están ahí, estáis todos invitados. Puedo asegurar que cuando organizamos esta sesión no pensábamos que iba a tener lugar en un momento tan crucial de la historia de Europa, aunque también es verdad que probablemente a partir de ahora todas las semanas van a ser cruciales. No creo que haya en el horizonte inmediato un momento de tranquilidad y de aburrimiento para los europeos, ¿no? En cualquier caso, nos encantaría poder contar con él otra vez y ver si efectivamente hemos tomado las decisiones correctas en el entretanto o tenemos otra Europa completamente distinta. Muchas gracias, profesor Beck. Vielen Dank. Gracias.